Morning. 2 days before Shell. Captain Sitar suppressed a smile as she watched the ops door close. Well, that was interesting. Solani is a little cranky. The last vestiges of sleep clung to her as she settled down into the command chair. She felt worn out, but it was the cusp of dawn, and Pod 7 had only just turned over control. Report on station? The perimeter secure, Joki replied crisply, pulling up the map of the campus on the main screen. Pod 1 is on station and reports 12 by 12. Sergeant Maurice is already complaining about janitor duty. Ah, first pod problems. Sitar shook her head, rubbing her eyes and blowing gently on her mug of tea. What about the objective? The objective secure, Roland piped up, already sounding chipper. The woman could have been a priestess of Jarfel. Her unwavering cheerfulness would have been a character fault if she wasn't so devoted. As it was a damn penance for everyone else at this time of day. Jelk finished running the obligatory shift change checks and stretched. Things wouldn't get interesting until breakfast, but watching the perimeter was a given. It didn't keep the curiosity out of her voice as she cocked her head and glanced over. What was interesting with Captain Tonnis, ma'am? Well, it appears she's expecting a call from Professor Warwick today, Sitar drawled out, taking a moment to savour their reaction. She felt a need to remind me she's devoted to Hela, and that if Biona or I let her sleep through the call, she's going to fuck us up the ass with a las rifle and pull the trigger. Roland was probably blushing like a cadet, but Jelk shook her head ruefully. I expect there's a butt in there somewhere, Captain. Well, yeah, she said that's where the rifle would go. Sitar snickered, before taking a long sip from her tea, and slid a bit lower in the command couch. Her eyes wandered to the traffic on the board. She also made it clear what'll happen if anyone listens in. Thoughtful silence descended. Sitar almost counted to 12 before... We're going to anyway, right, Captain? Jelk asked nonchalantly. You know, for security's sake. Sergeant, that would be a base infringement of Captain Tonnis's privacy, which is in fucking short supply for everyone in this bunker. She rubbed her chin thoughtfully, watching the steam rise from her mug. Deep's right we are. Lady Wakama regarded her guest with interest as their autocab plied its way about the outskirts of Prelentori. While she'd been free and cheerfully able to accommodate Kalira's request, Monsignor Santino Barcio, or Friar Barcio as he preferred, was not at all what she'd been expecting. She supposed it was a matter of exposure. The palace had never quite been the same since Princess Indara's wedding. Indara was one of those odd royals who, though well regarded, was seldom in the public eye. A perennial favourite of the Empress, indulging her unexplained absences, passed as a matter of course for the court. Widely known to be estranged from her mother, Princess Adwina, no one inquired either deeply or often, so when she suddenly resurfaced, her return would have equally passed without comment, if not for the wedding. Indara had shocked the entire nobility. While it was common for any woman to marry into an established family and become a co, the wedding should have been singular for a princess. Princesses didn't marry into families. Princesses formed them. And while Indara technically had done so, she'd taken on 3 unmarried women at the same time as her husband, who was a human. Favourite or no, the wags in the court were agog that the Empress accepted Adam so readily. The Empress, however, had been adamant. Indara and her family had her blessings, and were to be left alone. However, time had proven to be on Indara's side, as well as the Empress. After a wedding scene across the galaxy, Indara's family settled into a life of public duty. They spent long trips away from Shill, and while quietly dismissed as pleasure excursions, her trips often showed the throne to the outer provinces. Although her public engagements were few, she'd become a vocal advocate of the Empress's reforms against graft and corruption, and gradually, the jealous mutters about scandalous success and human debauchery faded away. Her marriage remained an unusual footnote, but time had demonstrated the value of Indara and her wives to the throne. Then, there was Prince Adam. Rumour held the prince had made a favourable impression on the Empress years before, at an event hosted by Indara's mother. While details had never been forthcoming, a more significant story about Adam wafted briefly through the ranks of the Golden Glaives. Both stories had been effectively silenced, but Wakama knew who to talk to, and being Kalira's guardian carried a certain clout all its own. Though that influence waxed and waned over the years, raising Kalira required being aware of events that could shape her future, and she'd proven herself to be discreet. Over time, doors had opened and words had flowed. Time had been on Prince Adam's side as well. As the years passed, she'd had an exposure to Prince Adam that few of the court and none of the public enjoyed. She'd been wary at first, but he'd been a good friend and mentor to Princess Kalandri before she joined the Marines, and however infrequent his presence, he always displayed a keen mind, a loving heart, and a steadfast duty to his wives. Privately, he absolutely doted on young Kalira, and possessed a loyalty to the Empress that you could bend battle steel around. The two got along famously. After all, he was a veteran. Not Navy, mind you, but you couldn't have everything. And so, as humanity began making forays upon the galactic stage, her first impression of the species had been favourable. She witnessed Adam mature into his role with the court, and while the issue of children remained unspoken, that faded as well. At the time, Indara had been safe in the line of succession. A year after the wedding, Kamordri became an adult, followed a year later by Kalandri, and the matter became largely moot. As for a second impression on humans, Kalira had provided enthusiastic reports about Thomas Warwick. While the princess thrived at the academy, Warwick seemed to be something special. The absence of a father in her life had been a void that no woman could properly fill, but she'd done her best. Although she'd entertained a few qualms, as the months passed by, Warwick remained a positive influence. Kalira's messages were infrequent by necessity, but she'd written about her distress over Warwick's family and clearly been moved. Prince Adam carried his own scars, but what veteran didn't? He hid them carefully around Kelly, and if Warwick had chosen not to, he provided a useful sense of perspective instead. It was time for Kalira to grow up, and that meant facing the grist of differing opinions and ugly realities. That was what education was actually for, and Warwick seemed to be doing admirably well as a grindstone. All of that was before the library incident, which settled her opinion once and for all. While erratic, irrelevant, and capable of violence, humans clearly could be a positive influence when channeled in the right direction. Indara has shown what a good Shilvanti woman was capable of with Prince Adam, and Lady Pelavon was following suit. And at least the wags at the palace wouldn't speak of Indara's state wedding again. As a subject for spectacle, Mevere Pelavons had put it to shame. Still, it was good to see Warwick married. While Professor Hemaris' scandalous exploits had faded from the public eye, older, more mature women didn't forget such things. The man had been a daring adventurer, and an inveterate gadabout, and an unmarried man around that many young women was too tempting for some girls. A wife or two, preferably more, resolved such idle fancies. If the Pelavon ceremony had been somewhat questionable in taste compared to Adam's, it remained legally binding. Warwick was willing to settle down, and by all reports his wife had a proper sense of decorum. Human men seemed to be a trial from the goddess, but hopefully she and her co-wife could sort him with time, love, and kindness. While exposure to only 2 humans was not what she'd call a comprehensive sample, in both cases her impressions had been quite positive. And so, when Kelly asked her to escort a human priest about the city, she'd been entirely willing. Thus far, it had been an enjoyable morning. While there had been occasional missteps, their conversation had been delightful as they travelled from property to property. Even so, she hadn't expected to meet such a kindred spirit. Admittedly, she'd stammered a bit when he mentioned eating the flesh and drinking the blood of his redeemer. On the other hand, she compared it to the first time she bled into the ocean, mingling salt in her blood with the seas. He turned shockingly pale, so she changed the subject. It was a purely symbolic act to Drebner, Just a cut on the thumb, for goddess' sake. She'd taken extra care afterwards. Barcio could be clearly a sensitive male, but diplomacy was part of her work. Even calling her role work was deceptive. She'd raised Kalira in every way an empress could not. It was easy for other women to appreciate the prestige of her position, but few understood the depth of it, or the satisfaction. During her career in the Navy, her flotilla had provided direct support for the Empress, and they'd come to work closely over 3 tours. After Kalira's birth, years later, the invitation came from the royal household to act as her guardian, and she'd never looked back. Competition had been fierce for the prestigious position, but applying had been the best move of her life. Empress Kamalesh loved all her children, and had spent as much time with each of them as she could, but her work was all-consuming, and after her husband's act of... well, the Empress had been there, but she'd borne her pain privately. She had lost herself in her work for many years before recovering a semblance of her former self, and her absence had taken a toll on her children. Camordri had taken it the worst. Calandria bounced back, while everyone doted on Loral. Barely more than an infant, Kalira had been far too young to remember. Wakama had been there through all of it. It was a good life, and the princess was a delightful girl. For Wakama, the absence of a man in her life was something she'd felt, now and then, but she invested her life in Kalira. The Empress treated her as a member of the family in all but name, and in a very real sense, the child you raised was your child. Looking back, some women might insinuate she'd given up her personal life to raise another woman's daughter. They couldn't have been more wrong. She had her calling, just as Friar Barcio had his. Yes, he was a priest, and his religious strictures were very unusual. A male priest in any of the Shilvanti faiths would never be placed under such restraints, and for a man to go unmarried was noteworthy. But she understood having a calling. Oh yes, she understood that as few others could. After discussing his needs, they set out to examine 3 properties around Puilantori. The friar's individual requirements were deceptively difficult when taken as a whole. A complex coupling a generous auditorium, ample administrative space, and he clearly needed substantial grounds to properly convey a sense of aura. Such accommodations were seldom on the market, and since he expected his colleagues to arrive in weeks, his need was immediate. Thankfully, urban renewal moved in waves. The ties of such fashions meant Puilantori was once again an up-and-coming area. While difficult to find, 3 older structures had the potential to be suitable, and so it was that she'd enjoyed learning about her guest as they explored the tiny district. The Monsignor spoke 4 other Earth languages fluently. He tended to break into his native tongue and hadn't mastered contractions yet, but his Vatica was passable, and he listened carefully, seldom needing to ask a word. After limiting her contractions when she spoke, their conversation flowed easily. Barcio had shown little enthusiasm for the first 2 properties, but their conversation regarding other matters never waned. She expanded on her devotion to Drebna, Shil, and the roles of each goddess while asking careful questions of his faith. His own inquiries proved thoughtful, and he was as arid in politely asking after her beliefs as explaining his faith. After their second hour together, she'd taken the liberty of calling Puilet Himeta Melamis. As a priestess of Drebna's second circle, Melamis had proven a valuable contact over the years. Well connected, she enjoyed a good relationship with many other prelates of the Divine Halls. She also got on well with Zinfes, the Rakiri's speaker of the Dark Mother on Shil. A meeting with Barcio would readily open doors for his group that might otherwise prove difficult to attain, and while Barcio's accent strained now and then, it was clear the Monsignor and the prelate shared a questionably low sense of humour. Given a chance, they'd probably get on famously. Certainly that would be a blessing. Their hunt for a suitable facility had not gone nearly so well, and while Barcio had been conciliatory towards the first 2 facilities, she could tell he wasn't taken with either. The last property wasn't high in her expectations, so she found herself casting her head to the side when it swept into view, and he clasped his hands in excitement.
Bella, "This is beautiful," he exclaimed. "It reminds me a bit of my childhood home in Cecile."
She looked out at the complex with its low, gabled roofs, as their cab wound up from the entrance. Beside the drive, a small river meandered through the campus past the main buildings. She tapped the console to slow their ride and considered the place in a new light.
"I'm, well, a bit surprised, to be honest, Friar."
"Please, we have been traveling for hours now, and I am not holding a service." The friar spared her a warm smile before gazing back at the premises.
"I would take it as a great kindness if you would call me Santino." "Very well, on the condition you call me Wakama."
It had been some time since anyone called her by anything but title or rank, and the informality was pleasant. Still, as their autocab closed on the end of the lane, she let such thoughts go and considered the location properly. The buildings were low, sensible cubes, but that was largely an end to it. The architect had made some unusual choices in Helka motifs that strained understanding. A long colonnade bordered the river, and that seemed nice enough. But the buildings? Foregoing purple was one thing, but they were beige. With unusual elements and the repressively bland colour scheme, it was small wonder the clerk handling the property confessed that the space had lain vacant. Its original owners went into foreclosure. The exotic design had proven unable to attract interest, lain dormant ever since. Barcio, Santino, seemed delighted, however, as she pulled up the specifications on her omnipad.
"This site has 2 smaller auditoriums besides the main one, while the central building has 4 floors. One is underground, but all the floors face an interior atrium."
As the cab gently halted in the car park, she climbed out to hold the door, but Santino had already scrambled out and was examining the gardens with evident interest. Tall stands of parago trees were losing the last of their fronds for the year, but she had to admit the grounds were substantial. Yesterday's storm had left the morning air cold and crisp, lending the gardens an appealing aspect. Untended since the last owners, much could be done with them. She had given up trying to escort the friar anywhere after their first 2 stops, and now they fell into an easy pace side by side as they strolled toward the main building. She turned back to the property itself.
"So, this reminds you of your home?"
It wasn't exactly Helcom architecture. Domes weren't covering every possible surface, but the builder had clearly been nodding in that direction. A promenade wound to the entry, supporting white chevrons that arced into the sky. The bright morning sky shone through clever cutouts, making the unusual design at least look light, rather than oppressive and unappealing. With a decent renovation, the facility had possibilities, and the price was comparatively low.
"See, oh, not so much like home, but there is the sense of it. I was born near the sea, and this feels similar."
He gave her a depreciating smile before rolling his eyes.
"It may not please everyone who is coming, but everyone is not here, so I am allowed some indulgence. Better to have something waiting than nothing at all. I confess, some of my colleagues thought we'd only manage when the bridge to Messina is finished." "You should not have been sent ahead alone. Surely your colleagues were not that worried about a poor reception?" she tutted.
Priest or no, there were decencies about a man travelling alone to be observed.
You shouldn't need a bridge to find a place for your mission. I don't know where Messina is, but I'm certain Prelate Malamis wouldn't stand for it." "Excuse my poor efforts. The older I get, the more I remember things like yesterday. Unfortunately, the yesterdays I remember so well were 30 years ago."
Barcio smiled wearily up at her as they walked.
"The bridge to Messina used to be a saying. People dreamed of building a bridge to Sicily, and it became something that never happened. My English friends would instead say, 'when hell freezes over.' Une expression vulgar, but much to the point." "Ah, I'm sure we can manage something, and this could be made presentable. Maybe change the beige to a pale violet?"
she offered helpfully, as she made it to the door first, holding it open.
"The aura inside isn't so bad." "You've said that several times, but I do not know what you mean."
He paused in looking around the entry, which had an open foyer, exposing the 2 floors above and led out to the atrium beyond.
What is aura? I do not think I know the word as you mean it.
Aura is... Wickham paused thoughtfully and gestured at the atrium. The interior was in better shape than the grounds, and the architect had done something clever. Not yet noon. A bevel along the top edge filled the space with sunlight. Have you ever walked along a beach and wanted to save a shell? When you are there? That is aura. When you take the shell home and think of the beach, that is aura, but less focused, diminished. You sense the beach because of the shell, but you are not at the beach. Places can have aura, but it is more than character. If you move for a place and find yourself experiencing it, that is aura.
Lord de Vol, I like this idea very much. It will be right at home in the Vatican. Not everyone understands a space can move the spirit or lend power to a message.
He nodded thoughtfully, as he cast his eye about the open space.
With the right advice, perhaps we can lead others to these halls.
Perhaps. If you tour the palace, I hope you'll allow me to show you about. A lot of the real gems are hidden from the public. She watched as he wandered towards the double helix stairways bordering the room. Those were definitely welcome. Walking up one side without meeting someone coming down the other was an interesting experience. Once. After that, they could be an absolute nuisance. Spotting the elevator, she called him back. The nice thing is this place is inexpensive. That will pad out your funds for a good remodel. Wickham quietly thanked the goddess that the builders had the good sense to install normal Chavanti-style elevators. The sides were open, granting a wide view out of the atrium. The grounds were terraced to create a small park that could make the underground space bearable, and the plans made them seem spacious enough. Not to everyone's taste, but pretty. I feel bad for asking, but can you afford the building? If the price of the first 2 bothered you, we can find others.
I would not hear of it. Thank you for your concern, but we are economical with our funds, and were sent with a generous sum. This is an important venture to everyone involved.
Barcia clasped a hand over his chest as he shook his head.
I cannot thank you enough for your help. You have surely spared me weeks, and I might not have found something half so suitable. As it is, the grounds are enough to gain me converts. Father Rossio and Pastor Weber will surely plant a vineyard before the inside is half done.
It's not a problem. I have plenty of time, she replied, dismissing the matter as inconsequential. I work at the palace, but with the court away and my daughter at school, I'm a bit at loose ends just now. At the very least, I insist on helping you through the paperwork. I wouldn't put it past some realty clerks to try and overcharge you. Someone from outside Shill, that is. I'll ensure they stick to the listing.
To someone not from Shill, or someone who is not Shilvanti, perhaps?
His head canted slightly to one side, but he smiled as he said it.
Certamente. I would not dream of preventing you, though Rabbi Kleinbaum would be bitterly disappointed she has nothing to moan about.
I hope you won't take this badly, as I've only met one human. Wickham gave him a smile. She was long past girlish uncertainty, and the Navy had taught her a generous measure of professional poise to go with her skills as a markswoman. You aren't what I expected. You know the Professor, then? He sucked in a breath and pursed his lips.
I am still deciding what sort of man he is.
No, actually. I know another human, but I have not met Professor Warwick.
So, you mean that I am not un barbaro? I am here to make sure that we are seen as something more than savage warriors, capisci?
He studied her expectantly.
While the Imperium is doing good work on Earth, some still live in want. The Imperium provides enough for all to survive, but not all live in plenty. We need to present ourselves well.
That seems like a very secular outlook, she offered, as they rode up to the 3rd floor. Barcio asked for an explanation of the word, and by the time they made their way through the first offices, he had the idea.
My church has not always troubled itself with such things, but our Holy Father is greatly concerned with such inequalities. He takes it upon himself to address such matters with the governess when their time allows." "Your church has a good relationship with her?"
"Extraordinario.
The governess adores our food, and while she was adamant about taking quarters in the Vatican, she has taken pains not to disturb us."
He shrugged dismissively.
"Je vous remercie." "It seemed a small price, and we have endured far worse." "I used to hear terrible stories about red zones on Earth, though the humans I've met don't seem the sort. It is good that you're all pulp?"
She tried the word and was rewarded with kind laughter and a gentle correction.
"It is good that your Pope concerns himself with the full welfare of the people and works with your governess. Our prelates share the same concerns. I thought the Empress was the head of your church. Now I find you have many—"
He groped for a word, frowning, and gave up.
"Questo accento è una provvida de fede. Denominations is not the right word, but she is the one revered, yes?" "Of course. The Empress has to show all of our virtues and none of our faults, but that's part of her role. To favor any divinity over the others could cause divisions. She has her personal preferences, of course, but never lets them be known."
Wakama explained carefully.
"It would be in poor taste. And poor politics, I think."
Santino gave her a long look. At his height it was difficult, but he managed.
"This makes sense to me now, that the Imperium leaves matters of faith alone. Una benedizione in aspetta."
Despite the serious topic, his fervent reply brought a smile back to her lips.
"It seems your Pope considers politics as well as economics." "People will always defend economic theories, which assume that growth will inevitably succeed in bringing about greater justice. This has never been confirmed by the facts, and expresses a crude trust in the goodness of those wielding economic power and the sacralized workings of the prevailing economic system," he said, stopping to clasp a hand over his cross. "Meanwhile, the excluded are still waiting." "That doesn't sound like scripture," she offered cautiously, as they made their way into a wider suite of offices on the second floor. "Esattamente. The words of Pope Francis, a good and blessed man who appointed me to my position. His successor, His Holiness John Paul III, is much of the same mind," Santino said quietly. "Our Saviour washed the feet of others and urged all to do the same. The hardest step is to be involved, to work together for change, as well as to pray. That is why I am here." "I pigri di corve trovano sempre una scusa. Some humans, they are yet angry with the Imperium. Now they have enough. They are bitter not to have plenty. For some there is never enough. The true poverty lies within their hearts," Santino said a bit testily. "Our faith teaches us to find salvation in eternal life, but others? Pigrizia. They see it as an excuse from taking agency in themselves. Jesus washed the feet of others. He did not lay down and wait for someone to wash his." Wakama turned the unfamiliar metaphor over in her mind, but decided she had the sense of it. "Sham teaches us that helping our families and one another is the same as helping ourselves. The rising tide bears us all from the reefs." It was a matter of faith, but that was why it was faith in the first place. On the whole, it seemed like a mature perspective that explained the changes she's seen in Prince Adam over the years. "You're here to meet with others, but this seems as much about knowing yourselves." "Sì, non è ut brutta cosa ever umlita davanti a Dio. Human beings, while we are capable of the worst, we are also capable of choosing the good, of rising up to make a new start. We are entering the galaxy." He gestured out the window at the world beyond. "If not now, when?" "So, when are you going to explain this masterpiece you four have been cooking up?" Marin asked. Sammy and Sam were barely awake, but the twins had already arrived, bright-eyed and enthusiastic, and Marin cursed the resilience of youth. The room was acceptably warm, but Ian had complained about the cold, and used the excuse to slip back into bed. She was considering her options for joining him. Somewhere, somehow, Sammy had found their rabbit pajamas again. "Sam, explain it to her. You do it better." Sammy yawned, but Marin suspected it was an act. Once something got their attention, sleep was usually an afterthought. "What now?" Sam had barely stumbled into the room and blinked. Bleary-eyed and barely awake, he looked like he'd been ambushed, which was exactly the case. "Please?" They sat back, pulling the ears, giving their best Roger Rabbit impression. Luminous green eyes peered out at Sam imploringly. "All right, I need coffee, but fine." Sam trudged over to the kitchenette and poked listlessly at the instant coffee. It was getting perilously low, but Marin was sure he'd brought more on the ship. Eventually, Sam gestured at the Kerbal sisters with his mug. "So, the girls want to create an artificial topological solution. It's like a black hole, except where it isn't. It's sort of a kink in space-time." "Made you say kink?" Sammy grinned impishly, and the girls blushed. Marin shook her head but paid attention. It felt far too early after another late night, but once everyone was up, you had to hang on for whatever came next. "So, what's that got to do with this hole you want to use for power?" Marin raised her voice just enough to drag the conversation back on track. "It's more of like a side effect. If it cuts the right angle, it goes into a realm of space-time we can tap for power. Think of it as an obverse of an energy drain, so it's like a white hole." "Let me guess." Marin shook her head and grinned, holding up a hand to forestall the inevitable. "Except where it isn't?"
Pretty much," Sam grumbled, blowing at his coffee. Marin glanced back at the twins. With Sam busy, the twins had gravitated to either side of Sammy. There was room left on the couch, and she wandered over to settle in beside one of them. The Sams had been complaining for years about a lack of focal power for their mass compression technologies, and while a rubber duck inside a diamond was impressive, they'd wanted to do something more. A lot more. She suspected if the twins were providing the means, then they already had something about to surface from the depths of their imaginations. Over the years, she learned to pick a bit, rather than take their answers as straight value. "And if things don't cut to the right angle, you remember how long it took to get rid of the Navy when you started talking about making black holes?" "It's not our fault they didn't understand," Sammy said defensively, crossing their arms and pouting at her before the rabbit ears fell over their face. "Who didn't understand what?" Akame yawned at the door. She cast a wink her way before wrapping her arms around Sam and gave him a quick hug. "What did I miss?" A parallel universe, if the math is right," Sam mumbled from the depths of his coffee cup.
"What, like identical versions of us?"
Marin watched Akame's nose wrinkle at the smell before she slipped away from Sam. Slipped down beside her, they rubbed shoulders a moment.
"Tell me, is there one where I get more sleep?"
"More or less identical, though it's not like you need to go into a parallel universe for that sort of thing. There's already a you out there somewhere right now, to say nothing of past and future you." Sam scratched his cheek idly for a moment. "It's just the math. The universe is so vast that there are exact physical cosmic twins of us out there somewhere, not to mention even more almost twins."
"Sam's right," Sammy perked up excitedly, bouncing on the sofa.
"Then there are quantum cosmic twins, which get weird because particles exist in multiple states, and you'd sort of overlap. But the easiest one is probably just another us elsewhere in the universe right now. That's sort of the point where the universe is bigger than you can imagine."
"So, exactly the same. Or almost."
One of the twins giggled.
"Just like us."
"Pretty much," Sam nodded, slowly emerging from the depths of his coffee. "Another you out there on another shill, or another me on a whole Earth even, just a little bit different."
"What, like an Earth that never met the Imperium?"
Marin canted her head, tossing out the obvious. It was hard to remember her life before, and she didn't want to contemplate the alternative.
"Oh, I don't like that idea."
One of the twins stuck out her lip.
"We want to come to Earth." "Yeah," her sister nodded, though she suddenly looked glum. "I don't know if Professor Warwick would mind, though." He'd be with his wife and daughter there. Oh.
Her sister's face crumpled.
I didn't think of it that way.
Well, don't. Sammy hugged them both a moment, though they held the first twin a bit tighter. The point is, somewhere, he's with them right now.
Wow, I guess so, she brightened. Just imagine, a whole Earth that never met the Shovanti. I wouldn't worry, sis, her twin nodded. I think Professor Warwick is pretty happy right now.
I am not happy about this. Tom glared at his omnipad before tossing it down in frustration. Miv looked up at her husband. It's an honor. She tucked her chin in and gave him a long, considered look.
What is it that's bothering you? Really? It wasn't Monsignor Basilio. Are you certain this isn't the same sort of thing?
Yes, I'm sure, he growled, looking away like a guilty child. All right, maybe. But this uniform is the silliest thing I've ever seen. It looks like a mushroom, and the hat only makes it worse. Tom grimaced at the omnipad accusingly. They won't take no for an answer, so now I'm on the rolls as a warden captain. Whatever that is. And this ceremony is ridiculous.
The ceremony is traditional, very symbolic. Besides, they don't make wardens out of anyone below the rank of captain. I looked it up. You were one before, so it's appropriate to make you one instead of a warden major or warden colonel.
She smiled at him serenely.
Surely it can't be the worst thing you've ever done?
He turned to wag a finger her way. I'll take that bet.
Worse than our wedding reception? She crooned, teasing him. Or maybe preterm night. I swear by the goddess no one will pinch your ass, except for Leia and I.
Fine. Her smile grew wider as he grumbled, but he was calming down already, and there wasn't any heat in it. Still, he stubbornly clung on to the point a while longer. It's in my top 5.
I'm sure you'll survive, husband. Now then, I have meetings all afternoon, so why don't you finish reviewing the menu? You'll feel better when all this is over and you can go back to cooking, chess, or starting that EE club. You might even give Solani a call or message her.
She gathered her coat and smiled demurely, though it harbored nothing innocent.
If I'm not here, you'll have perfect privacy. Just don't promise anything you wouldn't promise to me.
It's aye do, Tom groused, but he was already picking up his omnipad. She blew him a kiss and made her way towards the commons. Tom would probably stew a while, but he'd make the call. There would be time to meet with Solani on the common before she had to come home for dinner. Tom looked over the banquet menu, as if it might reach out and bite him. The whir stared up at him with perfect innocence. Appetizer. Fruit and cheese platter. Slices of various cheeses and fruits on a platter, providing a delicate mix of sweet, tangy, and creamy to invigorate the dining experience. Serve with a selection of sweet and semi-sweet wines. Soup. Choice of tomato or French onion soup, served with a piece of baguette and cheese. Salad. Strawberry salad with poppy seed dressing, an assortment of greens and fruit with a balsamic grain dressing to cleanse the palate. Entree. Cornish pasty. This herb-infused meat and pastry dish provides a counterpoint to the tangy taste of the salad and soup. Served with a creamy buttered mashed potato, a vegetable, humanely prepared, with chives, also a vegetable. Served with a selection of wines or ales. Dessert. Chef's sorbet surprise. A sweet treat complemented by a palate cleanser, ending the meal on a piquant note. His last call with Burdine had been a trial and a half. Omnipads were the definition of high fidelity, and hearing the little Shovanti hyperventilate for 10 minutes over the plan was pointless. At least Melondi had easier going with Vadim on her side. One way or another, this was happening. As a final consolation, he relented on wearing matching suits. Burdine frequently bemoaned Tom's lamentable fashion sense, and he perked up at that, promising to get him some appropriate formal wear for the occasion. Privately, he suspected his Shovanti friend was looking for a convenient alibi, if a riot started. In fairness, it probably wasn't a bad idea. Too late to use it myself, he muttered. It wasn't quite noon, and Miv was probably right. Instead of chess club or starting Aikido practice, or just cooking out at human food, he was stuck here at home. Miv's place was bigger, but most of his stuff was still in boxes. It left him listless and climbing the walls. If this worked, at least things could get back to normal. Mostly normal. He flipped back to the picture of the warden uniform on his omnipad. It was bad enough, but the hat made the whole thing look like a blue toadstool in silver filigree. He swiped the picture away like an act of revenge, but didn't toss the pad back on the table. Miv was right, and I promised to call Solani. Tom centered himself, pulling up the number. The universe was always in motion, and a true Taoist accepted their part in what came. That was the lesson of the vinegar tasters, and it held true. The painting showed the three men standing around a vat of vinegar. Each had dipped his finger into the vinegar and tasted it. The expression on each man's face showed his individual reaction. The painting was an allegory for Confucius, Buddha, and Lao Tzu. Confucius wore a sour look on his face. He believed life was out of harmony with the universe. As the second figure in the painting, Buddha had a bitter expression. Like the vinegar, life was painful and filled with attachments and desires that led to suffering. The last man, Lao Tzu, was smiling at the taste. To him, harmony existed naturally and could be found by anyone at any time, in any experience. He thought about his buddy Dave. The old Marine would probably shake his head and tell him to embrace the suck. It pretty much boiled down to the same thing. Not that he was against calling. Miv and Leia had practically taken turns urging him on and giving their views on why it was a good idea. They hadn't harped about it, but he knew which way the wind was blowing. And Solani's message had been short, sweet in the literal sense, and the sound file she'd offered up had been pretty nice, really. If he still said no, or decided he didn't like where this was going, they'd back his choice, of course. He didn't have a doubt in his mind, but with everything else in his life turned upside down, calling Solani seemed like a calm in the eye of a storm. It's just a phone call. Leave the chaos at the gate. He settled down on the couch to check his messages before giving her a call. It was nearly lunch.